Welcome everyone to our session on GRS Abutments. We are excited to have you here in this session. My name is Kiranu Shatami from University of Oklahoma, and together with Ben Leshinsky from Oregon State University, we are going to chair this session. A couple of items to note before we start the presentation.
Thanks. So you'll have the opportunity to ask questions during this on-demand session by simply clicking the questions button at the bottom of the video window. Your question will be sent to the presenter as soon as they are able to answer. You can claim PDH credits for this session or any other education session in this conference. You'll simply need to click on the Claim Credit button on the conference homepage. From there, you'll fill out the survey for any sessions that you attend. Please note that you'll need to include the verification code shown in this session to verify that you did indeed attend the session and ensure that you receive the proper credits. Please enjoy the presentations today, and thank you for participating in this virtual conference. Wishing you well.
Today, I'm going to talk about Illinois' second geosynthetic abutment. Here's the outline of my presentation. I will start with the project outlines, then we'll talk about the bridge type and the abutment type. Finally, I will talk about this bridge, the North Central DuPage Regional Trail over County Farm Road. Here's the project outline. The North Central DuPage Regional Trail over County Farm Road. It's a 3-span prefabricated pedestrian bridge. There are 2 piers, 2 geosynthetic reinforced soil abutments. Here's the project location. It's located at the northwest side of Chicago. Here's the bridge plan view. It's a 3-span bridge. Here's the elevation view of the bridge. You can see the truss. And here's the bridge cross-section view. It's a concrete deck. During the bridge type study, we investigate 3 options. The first one is a steel box girder bridge. Second one is a steel eye girder bridge. The last one is a fabricated truss bridge. Here's the cost comparison of each bridge. The steel box girder cost about $1.3 million. The steel eye girder bridge cost about $1.2 million. The fabricated truss bridge is very cheap, about $700,000. Here's the truss options we can choose from. Here's the bridge type study comparison. Now I'm going to talk about bridge abutment type study. We consider these 4 abutment types during the study. The first one is the integral abutment with a wraparound MFC wall. The second one is the full height cast in place concrete abutment. The third one is the abutment with slope wall. The last one is geosynthetic reinforced soil abutment. Here's are the highlights of geosynthetic reinforced soil abutment. It is economical, simple, very simple design, just design on the spread footing. So the foundation design is very simple. It's ABC accelerated bridge construction. The problem is they cannot handle large loading. Well, the geosynthetic abutment consists of the following elements: the facing elements, the reinforced soil foundation, and also the bearing bed reinforcement. Here are some pictures of geosynthetic abutments based from the FHWA. You can see the elevation view of the abutments. And here's the cross section of the geosynthetic abutments. You can see the facing elements, the bearing bed reinforcement and also to reinforce soil foundation. Now I'm going to show you some construction photos. The first one is the construction of the geosynthetic abutments. Here's the bridge elevation view. Here's the bridge deck view before they open the bridge. Here's the pier view. You can see they put some architectural treatment on the pier surface. Any questions? Thank you. That's the end of my presentation.
In this presentation, we are looking at a recent study that we carried out on two large-scale GRS bridge abutment models. The main objective of the study was to examine to what extent using large solid concrete blocks that are available from local suppliers could possibly improve the load-bearing performance of these abutment systems relative to a control model where we use the more common and much smaller CMU blocks. This study was part of Dr. Ridwan Dagher's PhD research program, and it was carried out with the help and participation of several other research assistants at the University of Oklahoma, who are listed later in this presentation. We know that in contrast to MFC walls, GRS bridge abutments are considered as composite reinforced soil structures due to the confinement effect that tightly spaced reinforcement layers provide within the structure, and therefore structural contribution of the facing is conservatively ignored in the design of these systems. Meanwhile, GRS abutments are built using different facing alternatives that include core CMU and different sizes of solid concrete blocks, as shown in the next slide. Here we see example facing types that have been used in GRS bridge abutments. The one on the top right is the first GRS abutment bridge in Oklahoma that was built using large solid concrete blocks. So in this study, we wanted to examine and quantify possible structural contributions of larger facing blocks in the load-bearing performance of GRS abutments. The idea was to see if we could obtain reliable and convincing improvement in their load-bearing performance relative to those we find in the current FHWA guidelines. In the long term, additional results similar to those presented here could help us to possibly increase the allowable service loads and perhaps reinforcement spacing to some extent, for instance up to 18 inches, in the abutments that are built with large concrete block facing to help build them faster and more cost-effective. Apart from a direct structural contribution, there are other important advantages in using large concrete blocks for the GRS abutment facing. Number one, they can provide a firm formwork during the construction of the GRS fill, and therefore they allow for a much better compaction process and increased fill density in the area immediately behind the facing. Better compaction in this very important zone within the GRS fill in itself is expected to improve the load-bearing performance of the abutment. And number two, also not having to readjust these small blocks during the compaction process, and the fact that a much smaller number of these blocks would be necessary in total to build the entire facing using commonly available construction equipment means that these larger blocks can potentially help to build these abutments faster than the more common CMU facing. This should help further the core purpose of this technology as part of the ABC and EDC initiatives, which has been to build faster and less expensive since their inception. Here are side-by-side elevation views of the two abutment models we constructed and tested in our lab. They were nearly 100 inches or about 2.5 meters tall. The facing of the control model on the left was built with standard 200 by 200 by 400 millimeter core concrete masonry units, i.e. CMU, whereas the one on the right included significantly larger solid concrete blocks from a local supplier. The dimensions of the full-size blocks in that model were 0.6 by 0.6 by 1.2 meters. Half blocks were used in the side sections. The photographs shown here were taken after the models had been fully constructed and the loading assembly was set up for the loading stage of the experiments. The blue load cells at the top have 400 kips of load measuring capacity each, which were placed on the top of a steel loading beam sitting directly on the top of the GRS fill. We can also see wireline extensometers that were used to measure facing deformations and settlements of the loading beam. Even though GRS abutments are invariably three-dimensional structures, we took provisions to reduce sidewall effects and directed our focus to comparing the performance of the two models within their 4-foot wide middle section in our tests. Therefore, you see full-height joints running on both sides of the middle observation section in these photographs to prevent interlocking of the facing sections along its running length. Additionally, the instrumentation for the most part was concentrated in this middle section, and also all reinforcement layers over the height of the models were placed separately in the three full height sections we see in these abutment models, i.e. the 4-foot wide section in the middle, which was flanked by two 2-foot wide sections on both sides. Here, the diagram on the left shows locations of drilled holes in the back wall of the test box that were used to run the wireline extensometers through. And on the right, we see potentiometers that were mounted on the back of the test box and were covered with a tarp. Here are drawings showing the wireline extensometer layout in each model. The small circles represent the contact points of the wireline extensometers with the reinforcement layers. An open graded aggregate called 3/8 of an inch cover number 2 was used that we obtained from a local supplier. Its gradation was comparable to, and in fact somewhat more open than the AASHTO number 89 aggregate, which is recommended and used in these abutment systems. Here are some snapshots of the construction procedure, including reinforcement instrumentation, placing and compacting of the fill, and the facing blocks. Here we see top views of model number 1 toward the end of construction. On the left, we see shorter reinforcement at 4-inch vertical spacing to make a bearing bed in the top section of the abutment under the loading beam. And on the right, rebars and infilling of the top 3 courses of CMU blocks for added stability in that section of the facing as recommended in the FHWA guidelines. The load was applied in steps of 10 to 15 kips at a time, followed by a waiting period to make sure that the short-term deformations were stabilized. We then proceeded to increase the load again in a similar pattern until we saw significant settlement under the loading beam. Afterwards, the load was also removed in steps until the models were unloaded completely. After that, the loading assembly was dismantled carefully, and we proceeded with the deconstruction of the models in layers, during which we measured GRS fill settlements at reinforcement levels. Now, as for some results, here we see facing deformations at end of construction for each model. The contour map on the left is for the model with CMU facing, and the one on the right for the model with large concrete blocks, which shows significantly less deformation at end of construction, i.e. a maximum of 0.6 inches versus 2 inches in the case of CMU model. Here in the bottom right of the slide, we see an example wireline extensometer layout for a reinforcement layer that was located toward the top of model number 2, with the back side of the abutment facing on the left side and the tail end of the reinforcement layer at the right end of the diagram. The extensometer lines were extended to the right all the way to the back of the test box, which would be outside the scope of diagram shown here. The graph on the left shows the history of displacement readings from the wireline extensometers for the same reinforcement layer, numbered from the facing, i.e. number 1, going toward the reinforcement tail end, which was number 5. The results show a consistent trend in measured reinforcement displacements throughout the test, which increased from the reinforcement tail end toward the facing throughout the testing period. Movements measured by the wireline extensometers that were attached to the tail end half of the reinforcement are attributed to the overall settlement of the fill and correspondingly the reinforcement layer at this location. But those wirelines number 1 and 2 that are significantly larger are attributed to both the settlement and outward movement of the GRS fill immediately behind the facing. The loading beam was 24 inches away from the back of the facing, which means that it was essentially right on the top of wireline number 3 in the diagram shown on the right. This type of data was used to calculate global strains in the reinforcement, which will be reported in future publications. However, in summary, they show that number 1, the connection loads at the facing were not significant, and maximum strains mainly occurred within the GRS fill directly underneath the loading beam. And 2, maximum reinforcement strains in both models were limited to about 1.5%, even at 40 KSF loading level. Here on the left, we see load settlement data for the 2 models. On the first model, we decided to increase the load until we could see significant deformations. However, we noticed that it was beginning to overstress the loading frame. Therefore, we decided to abort the test at about 360 kips of total load. We measured just over 6 inches of settlement underneath the loading beam, as shown in the inset photograph on this slide. However, we did not see any significant facing deformations, and pretty much the abutment looked intact and in very good shape. We decided to abort the test at a smaller load in model number 2 for the same safety reasons. The FHWA design load of 4 KSF and 0.5% settlement limit are also shown as an orange data point in the same graph for comparison purposes. Results show that both models were quite adequate relative to their observed settlement. However, model number 2 with large block facing clearly shows a better performance as compared to model number 1. The graph on the right shows a comparison of facing deformations in the 2 models as a function of the applied load. And again, we see that both models deform much less than the allowable limit of 1% height, which is roughly equal to 1 inch, even at much higher loading magnitudes than the design load of 4 KSF. Nevertheless, again, model number 2 showed significantly less facing deformation throughout the test. This slide shows another perspective on the facing deformations that we measured for those two models. Results are shown for the FHWA design load of 4 KSF and a much larger, i.e. by 1 order of magnitude, load of 40 KSF for comparison purposes. Again, the allowable limit for lateral deformation is 1% H, which is about 1 inch, which would be the right-hand side boundary of each graph. And here are some main conclusions. 2 large-scale instrumented model GRS bridge abutments were built and load tested to observe and measure differences in their load-bearing performances. Models were nearly 100 inches or 12.5 meters tall. The models were comparable to each other except for the facing blocks used. The size and type of concrete blocks used were significantly different. Both abutment models supported a 4 KSF, equivalent to 190 kPa, service load at significantly smaller settlement, facing deformation, and reinforcement strains than their corresponding FHWA limits. Model number 2, with much larger solid facing blocks, showed superior performance to the model with the more common CMU facing alternative. It showed small deformations at any load level. While not included in this paper, large block construction alternative was also found to be faster and allowed for better compaction of the field behind the facing. So overall, results presented in this paper and findings in an ongoing follow-up study suggest that large block GRS abutments could lead to improvements in the load-bearing capacity and performance of GRS abutments, with a potential for a more widespread use in local and county roadway projects. This study was made possible with significant contributions by the sponsors and individuals that are listed here, all of which is gratefully acknowledged. Thank you for your attention and your interest in this study.
Hello, I'm Jennifer Nix with the Federal Highway Administration. We've been performing a lot of instrumentation and monitoring projects on geosynthetic reinforced soil integrated bridge systems around the country. This paper focuses on a GRS IBS in Sheffield, Massachusetts. It's a 105-foot long span at 30 degrees skew on 2 GRS abutments with the GRS integrated approach. We wanted to look at the thermal interaction between the superstructure and substructure of this type of bridge system as compared to conventional integral abutment bridges. My co-authors on this paper are Michael Adams with the Federal Highway Administration and Mohammed Khan with HP Tech.
Hello, my name is Michael Adams, one of the co-authors of this paper. We've elected not to present each an individual slide, but to simply provide an overview of the outline. First, the GRS IBS. Most of us know what that is. The fundamentals of superstructure-substructure interaction due to thermal effect on small bridges. The general difference between an integral and semi-integral abutment. An overview of the Sheffield Bridge specific to its geometry, materials, and sequence of construction. The instrumentation plan specific to this paper are the contact pressure cells, the in-place inclinometers, and a reference pressure cell installed outside to monitor the ambient temperature. Results of this 2-year monitoring period are also discussed in the paper to show variations in seasonal and daily displacements and corresponding lateral earth pressures. The general comparison between this bridge and the measured movement of an integral abutment bridge, followed by general conclusions.
If you have any questions after reading through the paper or looking